And you're recording, so you're set.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. I think I know most of you probably, but my name's Chris Helzer. I'm the Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy here in Nebraska. And I want to talk today about the shared responsibility I think we all have for making sure that conservation happens and happens successfully. So if I can get there we go. No matter who you are on the call, scientist, naturalist, photographer, volunteer, somebody who works on fixing fences and spraying weeds, or somebody in outdoor education. All of us are working toward conservation success, but none of that's going to do any good if the public's not behind us. And if people don't care, we're in big trouble. And so it really comes down to everybody to help with that, regardless of which of those jobs or multiple jobs that you are. There are ways that you can help. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. I'm hoping that this is going to be something that'll inspire people or energize people a little bit. So why do we care, or why do we want people to care? There's obvious things, right? I mean, people need to care so that we have funding to do the work we want to do, policy support, and then just getting people to do things directly, whether that's a habitat project or changing their lifestyle in a way that's positive. And then, of course, all of us want people who think we're doing interesting work. And there are a lot of different audiences here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but anywhere from people who are active out in nature to people who are probably not, and the people who probably are not tend to be the majority, right? So most of the people in the world live in cities now, and many of those people don't feel very connected to nature. And so the numbers are working against us. And to show that in a different way, for those of you who are scientists and like graphs, there's a not good pattern here in the way this in the way this works. So people like birders and photographers and hunters really like conservation. They're very interested, but there aren't very many of them. And on the other end of that spectrum, people who live in cities, some of them certainly like conservation and are interested, but there's a lot of them who don't. And I wanted to point out, just to make sure everybody saw it, this is on a logarithmic scale, because that's important. Okay, so we could sort of bang the drum and hammer people over the head with why nature matters to people, because there are a lot of reasons to do that, right? And we're pretty good at, or getting better at least, at coming up with why nature matters to people. But that's a hard way to start a conversation. People tend to be drawn towards stories and emotions and empathy, and building empathetic connections is what we need to do, not just between us and the public, but between the public and nature. So what are those personal connections that we can help people draw? And monarch butterflies are a great example of something that's worked really well recently, right? Monarchs are in trouble, but they're a symptom of a larger issue. But people identify with monarch butterflies. They know about them, they've learned about their natural history, but also they see them and they're beautiful and they get to know them and they're something they grew up with. Monarchs are a great way to build a connection between people and nature. But there's other examples, right? I mean, if you know anything about grassland birds, bobolinks are one of my favorite ones to talk to people about because they sound like R2-D2. Everybody knows who R2-D2 is. And you can say, hey, R2-D2 lives out in the prairie, you should go out and see it. And that can be a connection that people build one way or the other. Yucca moths are a great story, right? Yucca moths are the only species that can pollinate yucca plants. And so you can talk about how the yucca moth actually grabs the pollen out of the anthers and carries it physically into or sticks it into the ovary to create seeds. And then if there are too many, and then it lays its eggs in there, and if there are too many eggs, and the plant's going to lose all of its seed, it just aborts the flower. And that's a crazy story, and it's a really fun one to talk about with people. One of the ones that I've learned about recently is the Southern Plains bumblebee, and Katie Lamke was really helpful in helping me figure out how to identify this one versus other ones. And basically the Southern Plains bumblebee has a really good haircut, right? It's got very neat looking, short, well-combed hair, it looks like. So compare that to this one, right? This is a scraggly looking regular eastern bumblebee. And then I'll show you another picture. This is the Southern Plains bumblebee. It doesn't matter probably ecologically, but it's a connection. It's something that people can relate to. You can talk about the Southern Plains bumblebee, and that's where I would start. I wouldn't start with the fact that it's also a very rare bumblebee that's in a lot of trouble. You can get to that point, but starting with the fact that it has a good haircut is going to get people's attention and build a connection before we get into the rest of the story. Hognose snakes are phenomenal in terms of a really cool story. You got to be a little careful who you talk to with it, probably if they're not a snake person. Maybe starting with a snake that looks really scary is not the way to go, even if you then talk about how it plays dead. If you, continue to bother it, then I think it looks really cute. I mean, how can you not admire that face, right? It's just such a great face. So the point of all of this is that we need stories, but we also need to meet people where they're at. And all of us have known people who are at various places in this spectrum, right? We had somebody several years ago at the Nature Conservancy's Deer House at the Platte who was deathly afraid of box elder bugs. And she had a group of young women with her, and she took them home because she saw a couple of box elder bugs in the house. That's an honest reaction to nature that we need to be aware of, that there are a lot of people who have. And so we need to figure out how to know where people are and send our messages, build our stories based around that. So for some people, our message needs to be calming, right? Nature's not going to kill you. There are things that are okay. Just because it's an animal doesn't mean it's a bad one, even if it's in your house. People who just don't think about nature very often, it can be helpful just to point out that nature exists right around them, right? Robin's nests are great because there are robin's nests just about everywhere if you really start looking for them. Now, you have to be careful what kind of nature you point out, because you could go too far, maybe too quickly. And if you hit the wrong people with the wrong story, you go backwards, and then you have to start back again at the far left end of the spectrum. But hopefully at some point we can start getting people, once they've noticed nature, to start thinking about some of the really cool stories. Things like painted lady butterflies fly up here every year. They migrate all out of the desert Southwest every year. So all the ones we see don't start out in Nebraska. They start out in the desert Southwest, and then they migrate back again in the fall. It's a really cool story. And you could talk about monarchs do something similar. This is a different species that also migrates. If you get them more and more curious, eventually you can go back to the stories that maybe won't work if they're at a different place in the spectrum. But now, mud dauber wasps can be really interesting, right? Eventually, we want to get them out into nature a little bit more. That's a really important step. And then get them involved in different activities, especially things like community science projects like the Bumblebee Atlas. And then eventually, we build a constituency, right, that has power, that's going to back us if we have issues we need help with. It's going to help provide funding for the work that we think is important, and may actually go out and do some of the work themselves. So to do that, this is something that Mike Forsberg has really helped me think about more deeply, is that you have to make this personal for people. You can't start with statistics. You can't start hitting them over the head with utility of nature. Talk about you, right? Talk about what you do. You might have a job that you think is not all that interesting, but I guarantee that you can make it interesting to people because they don't know what it is you do and they don't know why. And you can talk about what you do behind a computer. You can talk about what you do in the field. You can talk about why you're doing it. And the why is the most important part, right? Talk about why you care about conservation, what it is that drives you. And that builds an empathetic connection with somebody else, and they're going to better understand what it is you're doing and why, and they'll start to think a little bit about that differently. So you can do this with people in person. You can do it via social media. You can do it with any group of people or any individual people that you interact with. And it's important to do it because if all of us are doing this, we're reaching a whole lot of people. So to me, there are two things that are wrong with this picture right here, okay? The first one's easy to fix. There, that's better. The second thing is, I don't think we should lead with statistics like this, right? Why would you lead with a fact before you've established some empathy or a story behind this? I would rather start out with something like this. Man, we did this great prescribed fire today. We killed a bunch of cedar trees. The response is going to be amazing. We're going to see all these butterflies and birds next year. That's great. People are going to be interested in that. They'll be drawn in. Now, they might ask at that point that, you know, why are cedars even a problem? I didn't know that was a big deal. And then you can hit them with the statistics, okay? You bring them in first, and then you hit them with the numbers, rather than trying to hit them over the head with the numbers first. Social media, you can do the same thing, right? I work really hard, and I'm not saying I'm great at it, but I try really hard on social media to share stories that are personal to me, so that people who know me will also sort of see through my eyes the nature that I'm talking about. So here's that painted lady butterfly again. Or, you know, just the sort of everyday work that we do at the Nature Conservancy, and the same everyday work that all of you do. You can make that interesting by talking about why you care about it, right? What are the emotions that that work brings up for you? Why do you feel like it's important? What are you trying to achieve with it? People will get that, and they'll follow along with you. Eventually, ideally, of course, we want people out in nature, because that's where those connections are really built for themselves. They can explore nature, they can come up with their own stories that then they share with other people, and we spread that influence. And to get people out, it really helps, again, to tell your own stories. Talk about the species that you see that people might recognize. Talk about why you're going out to these sites, and pick common sites that are easy for people to get to, and talk about why they might go. You know, what kinds of flowers might they see? What are the wildlife that are out there? What's happening right now that people would be interested in going and see? And you don't have to be someone who works for an organization that does a lot of outdoor education to do this. You can do this in any role that you play. You can help spread the word that there are really cool sites to go look at, and here's why you should go look at them. And then the other part of that is, people who aren't familiar with nature aren't going to enjoy their visit if they don't understand what it is they're seeing, right? Remember back to the first time you started learning plant species, right? Before you knew what plant species were, everything kind of looks the same, and it's hard to be really interested in something if everything looks the same and you don't know the difference between one thing and another. So anything that we can do as naturalists, as ecologists, as anybody who plays a role in conservation, to help people understand and appreciate what they're going to see when they go out to a site, the better. Some of that can be, we can go with them, right? But it's really hard for us to go with everybody. But we can host field days and demonstration sites, and we can get people out to our sites that way. But we can also help just provide ideas like, hey, if you go out to 9 Mile Prairie, here's something to look for, right? Butterfly milkweed's blooming right now. And you might know butterfly milkweed. It's that orange milkweed that you might see around town. You might even have in your garden, right? Well, it's blooming out in the wild right now. It'd be a great time to go see it. It's really pretty. Find things that are familiar to people and remind them they can go see them in nature, or help them understand, like, hey, if you go out to the prairie today, you might see butterflies and you might see moths. You know, here's a good way to tell between them, right? If you see fuzzy antenna, that's a moth. If you see straight antenna with a little knob at the tip, that's a butterfly. That gives them something that they'll know, something they can look at. Even if they don't know what kind of butterfly it is, they'll at least feel some confidence and say, oh, that one's a butterfly, and I know why. And we took a stab at this with the help of some master naturalists several years ago, and created what we called the Explorer's Guide to Prairies. I would say it's a good first step. There's some things I'd like to do more with it. But the idea, again, was it's not a field guide. It's a guide to what to look for when you visit a site for the first time, especially if it's a prairie. And then, I don't want to spend time on this too much because a lot of people have seen this, but I did a project a couple of years ago with a square meter of prairie, right, where I spent a year photographing everything I could within a square meter. And I was able to share with people a lot of profiles of a lot of different species, but also just things that weren't necessarily species, but just fun things that I found within that square meter. But it was a lot more than just, you know, here are all the species that I found within the square meter. It was stories about what I thought about them, right? So butterfly milkweed, I had a plant in my plot. It only had one flower. I didn't ever see any pollinators on it. I didn't know if it was going to make seeds. It made one seed pod, and I worked really hard to make sure I didn't miss the seed pod. It was a story. I got to see things like the lynx spider, which I'd never photographed before, and I got to watch it closely enough that I got to see it hunt. So I got a lynx spider. I saw this little fly. I saw the spider catch the fly. It was a really cool story. And I was able to talk about why that was fun for me and why it was worth sitting still for a long period of time to see it. I photographed my first ever tree frog in that square meter plot. That was a really cool day. And it really was an experience that helped me, you know, learn the value of sitting still. I photographed in a different way than I normally do. There were a lot of things that I was able to make very personal about that project. And so one of the things that came out of that project was that I photographed 113 species within a square meter. That's really cool, right? And you could make a headline about that online or on a newspaper that says, hey, scientists found 113 species in a square meter. That would catch people's attention for about 3 seconds. And that's good, that's something. But the project has really resonated because it was something, I made the project more about me and my experience, and it was a very personal story that resonates much better than a single headline about some scientific number. And I honestly stumbled into that. I mean, I sort of had some of that in mind, but the project sort of developed itself. But I learned a lot about how to do storytelling because the project worked rather than the other way around. But it was, again, a combination of the fact that I had photos and stories to share about individual species that built connections between people and the species that I saw. The fact that the project I did was something anybody could do, I think was really helpful. And I've heard from a lot of people that they've tried to do something like that with their kids or by themselves, where they pick a small area and they go look at it multiple times and try to see what they can find. That's a really cool thing for me to hear. And then again, I made it about me as much as about the story, which I get that that's hard. It's hard for me too, because a lot of us don't like to draw attention to ourselves, but it doesn't mean that you have to brag about yourself in order to share what you think, what you care about, what's important to you, and what you felt during a particular process. So what I'm hoping to do is, not everyone is a photographer, not everybody's a writer. Everybody has their own way that you interact with nature and then interact with people. So what I'm hoping is that what I'm talking about here is going to help you think differently about the kinds of stories that you can tell and who your audience might be, right? It could be people at church. It could be people that you see on the street as you're walking around socially distanced. It could be people on social media. It could be relatives. It could be friends. It could be all these different people, whoever it is that you interact with, and whatever way you interact. What are the ways that you can share stories about conservation and the work that you do to try to get other people to care?
3 minutes.
Good. Last 2 slides. So the point is very simple, right? On this spectrum of how people deal with nature, if everybody's on the left side, we're in big trouble. What we really need to do is we need to shift everybody to the other end so that we have a constituency that's going to help us succeed in conservation. So that's all I got. Questions, comments, critiques, welcome.